Thank you for joining us today. My name is Georgette Vigil. I'm the Senior Director for Alumni Engagement and Outreach at Colorado Law. During the presentation, Zoom participants can ask questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can vote on the questions that interest you the most. If you are connected via YouTube or Facebook Live, we are monitoring your questions and we'll post them into Zoom for consideration. Phil Weiser will respond to questions following the presentation. As a reminder, everyone is on mute. We appreciate you being here and are excited to have over 750 registrants for this talk. It is my pleasure to introduce Jim Anaya, Dean of Colorado Law.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to this evening's Colorado Law Talk, Leadership in a Time of Crisis, featuring Phil Weiser, Colorado Attorney General and a member of our faculty. The Colorado Law Talk series was launched in 2017 to share the groundbreaking research, knowledge, and ideas of the Colorado Law faculty with the broader legal community in the Denver area, and especially now that we've gone virtual with the legal community throughout the state and beyond. Before I introduce the Attorney General, I want to acknowledge the difficult circumstances brought about by the global pandemic, and also that some in our communities are especially burdened or experiencing tragedy because of it. And on top of this, our country is now going through a crisis of faith in the promise of equality that is embedded in our institutions. I share in the grief and outrage brought on by the violent death of George Floyd. Of course, violence is not an adequate or justifiable response, but long festering wounds experienced by people of color are in desperate need of healing. I hope you'll join me in renewed resolve to build a truly just America. It's now my pleasure to introduce Phil Weiser, Colorado's Attorney General and a longtime member of the University of Colorado Law School faculty. Many of you know that Attorney General Weiser has dedicated his life to the law. Before becoming Attorney General, he held the Hatfield Professorship and he was Dean at Colorado Law. While at the law school and university, he founded our Silicon Flatirons Center for Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship and co-chaired the Colorado Innovation Council. His public service includes serving as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice and as Senior Advisor for Technology and Innovation in the Obama administration's National Economic Council. He was on President Obama's transition team overseeing the Federal Trade Commission and previously served in President Bill Clinton's Department of Justice as Senior Counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division, advising on telecommunications matters. Attorney General Weiser's impressive career path also includes being a law clerk for Judge David Ebel at the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and then clerking for Justices Byron White and Ruth Bader Ginsburg at the U.S. Supreme Court. We're very fortunate to have such an exemplar of public service and commitment to justice with us today. I'm now happy to turn the program over to Colorado's Attorney General, Phil Weiser.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate your leadership. I have often said your job is harder than my job. Having done both, I think I'm just going to say that your humanity, commitment to service, your values are so commendable. And I think the law school is fortunate to have someone who cares as deeply and who is as aligned with the best spirit of what the law school represents. So thank you for serving and doing what is not easy during a time where I would say we face three sets of crises that are going to be with us. And I'm going to talk a little bit about all three. First, I'll say a word about myself, then talk about the nature of these crises and how we respond. Mostly I want to leave time for questions because I recognize we've got a lot of people, including a lot of friends, who are with us today. Let me start by noting the crises, noting a few thoughts about them, and then I'll get into the main talk. We have a public health crisis right now that is killing Americans at a rate we've not seen and that we're not even close to being through. We've got an economic crisis with people who are unemployed, who are struggling to make ends meet, that is threatening in profound ways with a lot of fear out there. And now we also have a justice crisis. As Dean and Naya said, the killing of George Floyd rightfully tapped a nerve and triggered a sense of outrage and protest that we are very much still processing. And all these crises feed into one another. And that is a challenge to America, the idea of America. As Jim said, my commitment is to service and the law. And I believe that together we can find our way through difficult times. As Jim said, I spent a long time on the faculty. I'm a deep believer in the rule of law. I'm a deep believer that we're in it together. And Colorado is a special place. I was a very happy member of the law school faculty and looking at a potential third time to go to Washington before our family's journey was sent in another direction. 2016 didn't go the way I expected, and I had to ask myself, am I willing to serve? And so I put myself on a journey. And that journey is one that's fraught because these crises build on a legacy of a crisis of trust. And so underlying our ability to deal with all three crises I mentioned is a lack of trust in our institutions. And that trust is least provided to the federal government. Now, what you'll see is shrinking trust in the federal government as well as shrinking trust in one another. At the same time, people believe that it's important that we turn this around. And so we are in this situation where people are craving institutions they can believe in while losing confidence in those institutions. And if you look at who trusts who, you'll see demographic and generational impacts. 18 to 29-year-olds are low trusters. 65 and above, high trusters or at least medium trusters. This doesn't bode well for our future. And it underlies this sense of upset and anger, and it's not distributed equally. There are some groups in our society, thankfully for our ability to deal with a pandemic, scientists. We've seen some great public health professionals step up and be trusted. Who is trusted the least? Elected officials. So if you note, going from a university professor to an elected official, the level of trust in me went way down. It's worth knowing, what do people trust vis-a-vis others? People trust people to report problems, to obey the laws. However, there's some other areas, not so much trust. To accept election results, regardless of who wins. To respect the rights of people who are not like them. Have civil conversations. This is a crisis in our civic life. And again, that crisis is related to, do people believe that their elected officials are telling things straight? Not so much. 64% find it very hard or somewhat hard to know what's true or not true when they listen to elected officials. 50% of people almost can't know what to trust what they see on social media. In many cases, that skepticism is deserved. And those who are more trusting, say, of social media, are more likely to get scammed. And that's part of what has created this challenging moment. I'd like to recommend a podcast to everyone, both season 1 and season 2, for different reasons. Season 1 of Against the Rules is about institutions in our society and how they're not working for people. Season 2 is about coaching in our society and who gets the benefit of coaching and who doesn't. COVID-19 comes in the midst of all this, and on top of COVID-19, an economic crisis and now a justice crisis. What is worth noting out of COVID-19, and I also believe out of this justice crisis we are in, is a massive humanizing force. And David Brooks put it this way, allowing us to see each other on a level deeper than politics. What you'll also see is the survey. Are we all in this together? What did people say in the fall of 2018? 63% said that. 37% said everyone's in it for themselves. In the midst of COVID, that became 90-10. And more Americans than ever believe they can count on each other. And Americans supported steps to shut down the economy, knowing it would hurt them, trusting that we're all in this together. So how do we get through this difficult situation? I'm going to note 3 areas, and I believe they apply as well to our economic and our justice crisis. First, ingenuity, then resilience, then grace. Ingenuity. CU Boulder was one of the first universities to say, we've got a way forward that will manage a fall semester that's going to be different. That's powerful. And that's Colorado creative problem solving. We're also working remotely now in a way that many of us didn't know was possible. I had an agenda for remote work at the Attorney General's office, but we've completely gone beyond what I've even expected, and it's not easy. The life that we on the work front and the family front and the life front has gotten mixed together, and it's really hard. And a lack of technology, including broadband, is making this challenging, but we are working hard to work through this. Resilience. Americans have often pushed efficiency as a value. We have, on occasion, honored equity as a value, but we rarely reflected on resilience as a value until we don't have it. The lack of testing capacity was one of the most painful signs of a lack of resilience, but not the only one. Of people. Grace. People are hurting, are afraid, whether it's of their student loans being pushed to pay them or being evicted from their home. One of the critical responses, and our office is involved in this, is how we provide grace so that people get some more slack. Can Colorado save America is the question that I've been asking since the fall of 2018. And that question came from an article that was published by Roger Cohen. And he said, it's impossible to drive around the state and not be reminded of the boundlessness of American potential. Coloradans believe in creative problem solving. Whether it's how we build trust and confidence and accountability in police, how we reform and improve our criminal justice laws as part of this justice crisis, whether it's how we're there for each other and support citizens and consumers in economic crisis, or how we take on a public health challenge, Colorado, in many respects, has what's best about America. And to be the people's lawyer for that project, one of the first things I did was set up a vision and a mission for our office. And the mission here is, together we serve Colorado and its people by advancing the rule of law, protecting democracy, and promoting justice for all. And that guides why we do what we do. And let me talk you through a little bit of that and how it fits, again, this moment. So one of the institutional challenges is whether people believe in the rule of law and it being applied fairly and not based on partisan political games. One effort that was painful to behold was a politically motivated strategy to undercount people in the census. Everyone now can be counted. I encourage people to make sure their friends are being counted. Colorado is set up to get another member of Congress. There's more federal funds as long as we are counted. Well, the effort by the federal government under Commerce Secretary was to ask a question about immigration status, even though the design and the act was to undercount. The Constitution says everyone shall be counted. Doesn't matter who you are, doesn't matter your immigration status, everyone shall be counted. That's what the Constitution says. We fought for that constitutional mandate, and we won it at the Supreme Court, defending the rule of law. When you talk about people hurting, as well as our criminal justice system not working, the opioid crisis is often on my mind. Because in 2017, the year after the chart here, more people died of overdose deaths, mostly opioids, than in the Vietnam War and the Iraq War combined. And you see what parts of Colorado this hits on this map which shows overdose deaths. These are often poor areas. They're areas that are often struggling. And so this is an insult on top of an injury. And when I've gone to some of these communities and I said, how do we help rebuild a better economy and community? I'm often stopped in my tracks and said, the first thing we got to do is address this opioid crisis. So I've made this a top priority, brought on Heidi Williams as an opioid response chief, and we are now suing some pharmaceutical companies who made a bunch of money lying to people, and they need to be held accountable, and we want to get that money and use it for education and prevention efforts, treatment, and recovery efforts. When we talk about criminal justice reform efforts, one of the areas that is so important is how do we address pretrial? You hear this talked a lot about, but yet Colorado has yet to make the move. When someone is arrested, they are often detained and not able to pay the money. If you have the money, and about half the people do, you can get out. But half Americans can't pull together $400 for an emergency expense, which means if you come in contact with the criminal justice system and you're poor, you're likely to stay in jail, lose your job, be apart from your family, and have your life upended. We need to fix that. And one of the most painful parts about government, unless we get money to support this fix, we can't fix it, even though this will save money over the long term. And one of the tragedies of the economic crisis we're now in is that our belt tightening at the state government level is likely to undermine this reform that had been my #1 legislative priority. Another critical priority is making sure consumers know that we've got their back, so that when CenturyLink overbills Colorado customers or Equifax doesn't protect their data, we will go to bat for the people of Colorado, where we can get the money back to the people who were cheated, or where it's, let's say, more diffuse, like the Equifax case. Better support cybersecurity here in Colorado so that people aren't hurt again. When I talk about resilience and protecting communities, water is a big topic. I, of course, had the benefit of learning this from David Getchis and Charles Wilkinson, two giants in our Colorado law community. And one of the things I've learned is the painful costs of what's called buy and dry. As we have less water from climate change and more people, that is a difficult equation. We can't deficit finance water. So where's the water going to come from? The worst way to do it is to literally take all the water from agricultural communities and leave those communities with no local economies. Crowley County used to have a thriving agricultural economy. It doesn't anymore. It's got about half the population it did 30 years ago. And its #1 industry right now, prisons. We developed a water plan in Colorado that is about collaboration and innovation and resilience, because we have a compact with other states called the Colorado River Compact, and we have to renegotiate it because the Colorado River, as Doug Kenny and others in the Getchis Wilkinson Center know far better than I, is a resource that is being strained. And we need to make sure that we protect that river, protect Lake Powell, Lake Mead, and to do so is going to require some real ingenuity, collaboration. And we're set to do that, but it's got to be happening the right way, which is not buy and dry to shut down local agriculture communities. All of these issues, whether it's how we reform criminal justice, how we manage trust and accountability in our law enforcement professionals, how do we protect consumers, we've got to think differently. And this is not easy because for a lot of people, change is incredibly intimidating and hard. By working together as a team in a values-led way, we believe the Department of Law can be an engine for innovation in our state. Our values include being innovative and being better together, which means that we work as a team, but not only of those in the Department of Law, which includes people across different sections, but with people outside the department. Bill Joy had this great saying. He was the founder of Sun Microsystems. The smartest person working on your issue is not working for you. And so we're always looking to say, we're trying to solve these problems. How do people help? And part of what we plan to do, and we'll keep doing, and this is something I absolutely learned at CU Law School, is try ideas. Measure them, see what happens. If they work, keep doing them. If they don't work, try something else. That's an opportunity we have in this world where you might say strategic thinking and planning is overrated and experimentation is underrated. People could spend 6 to 12 months on a strategic plan, or let's just try it. Let's come up with a beta test and see what happens. And that's one of the beautiful things of federalism, which is even where you have a dysfunctional federal government, our state government is positioned to be a leader. The point I made earlier is worth representing here. The leadership happens not in a hierarchy, but in a network, where we're looking across our state, whether it's building a network of people doing safe gun storage or addressing the opioid epidemic in innovative ways. We have the opportunity to collaborate in all sorts of ways. And again, this collaboration and effort across the state is something I learned during my time at CU. Silicon Flatirons started this idea called Startup Colorado, and version 1.0 was how do we stitch together entrepreneur communities in Denver, Boulder, Colorado Springs, Fort Collins, working together on a shared mission of supporting startups here in Colorado. Version 2.0, which is a collaboration with the state of Colorado, was how do we support entrepreneurship in our rural areas to solve important problems, help those communities build economies in the future. And that's something that, again, inspires me about what we can do in Colorado. Same, I was on the founding board as a dean and law professor of CareerWise Colorado, which is about apprenticeship-based learning to help people graduate high school with a marketable skill. And that's something that's, again, all across Colorado. Here's what many of you heard me say at CU, and now people in the Department of Law and elsewhere in the state hear me say. We're in this as a team. Not everyone needs to do everything. Everyone needs to do something. And enough people need to do enough things. There's a biblical version of this, which comes from Ethics of Our Fathers, which says, you don't have the obligation yourself to repair the world, but you're not free to desist from doing your part. All of us as citizens have a part to play in how we heal the world, in how we take on these 3 crises. And that's something that Colorado is well positioned to do. And I am so committed to learning and collaborating across the state. And so I traveled a bit as a dean around Colorado, as an attorney general that's gone on steroids, with town halls in places where attorney generals had never shown up, let alone Democratic attorney generals. So when I went to Canyon City after we had a gun safety law called an extreme risk protection order, someone from the local Republican Party came to me and said, I'm calling on you to resign your position. And I said, well, I was hoping for your endorsement, but I'll work harder for it next time. And we had a very good conversation about their concerns about this law. And I articulated how I thought we could help implement this law so that it would save lives. And even since the law has been passed, a sheriff who initially was a little skeptical about it has been a partner of ours as we've successfully defended the law's constitutionality and enforcement. Because together we can listen to people. When I was in a town hall in Colorado Springs, a student came up to me and said, why are you supporting this gun safety law? And I said, well, I believe in the Second Amendment. I also would ask a question for you, because the person suggested I didn't think the Second Amendment was the force of law. And I said, why are you more worried about taking a weaponed firearm from someone who is a law-abiding person as opposed to not taking a firearm from a young person who otherwise will use it to kill him or herself? And the student said to me, I need to think about that. And so that's what dialogue is about. It's not proving who's right. It's about listening and asking questions. And so I want you to ask your questions. I know Jen's going to take us through a lot of them. I'll get to as many as I can. I so value this community. And I know a lot of us are searching for what's the path forward during this time? What's the role each of us can play? And I remain optimistic about how we in Colorado can lead that way forward.
Thank you so much, Phil, for that wonderful presentation. You draw a large crowd and also a curious and engaged one. So I know we will have more questions, but we have one already from Jeff Esses. I'm going to start my video. Hi. And Jeff's question is, what effect has the suspension of jury trials had on the AG's office prosecution of cases?
This is a very important challenge we've faced in the COVID-19 environment. We and other public law offices have had to put a pause on litigation. And the short answer is that full effect has not revealed itself, because what we've basically done is back everything up. And so the effect is going to continue to be revealed. And I worry about justice deferred as justice denied. And so what it's causing us to do is think really hard about our priorities, our tools, and about how we respond to this crisis of justice, because we need to protect access to the courts. And to my earlier point about pretrial, I'm really worried about people who might be sitting in jail waiting for a trial while trials get pushed out. And so we're trying to use all the tools we can to protect people and to adapt to this situation. So this is very much the question gentleman asked. It's a work in progress for us.
Next question is from Kathleen Sutherland. She asks, Phil, what are your plans to address the new Title IX regulations?
I've been public about this. I plan to sue the federal government for adopting rules that are, to my mind, flatly, wrongly displacing state authority. We have a law in Colorado that protects how students are to be treated in such situations. I want to protect that law. And the challenges to implement this new set of requirements within a few months during a pandemic is mind-blowing. So we'll be challenging this law, or challenging this regulation.
Patricia Peterson asks, as a lawyer, one of the particularly painful losses of trust is in the U.S. Supreme Court. How does that get revived?
This is a very important point. Let me take a few minutes on this, because it's not a short answer. And let me start with a little bit of a point of personal privilege, because I had the ability to appear before the Supreme Court actually by telephone in the faithless electors case. What was important about this case was the timing of it removed it from a political context. I will say one of the worst things that happened to the Supreme Court in the last quarter century is Bush versus Gore, because the court put itself in a position to decide a presidential election on a 5-4 decision where the Republican appointees were on one side and the people identified as the more liberal justices were on the other side. And that's terrible for the court. The case I argued, from the argument, and I believe from the decision, you won't be able to draw those ideological lines, because so many Supreme Court cases need to address legal principles that should be outside the context of deciding an election. That's why there was, again, Wisconsin issue that came to the Supreme Court was another blow to its institutional credibility. I believe we're fortunate that John Roberts, as a Chief Justice, cares so much. So the recent case from California involving a challenge to a public health order, Roberts refused to have the court get immersed in that. And that's something that I appreciate about John Roberts. John Roberts has already said once that the Affordable Care Act is constitutional. He will have that chance again. So we are resting a lot on the shoulders of John Roberts to have the court's institutional legitimacy preserved. And we have to rebuild that trust a brick at a time, with the court showing its commit legal principles and not to be viewed as a, let's call it, purely political or ideological actor. And it's going to take, again, a continuing effort. I worry about our judicial branch. I will tell you, from the federal government perspective, the judicial branch is the one branch that I see as functional. I don't see a functional Congress. I don't see a functional executive. So it's a really, really important question, and we all need to think about that project. If I can jump to another question that's a little related, because it's on the constitutionality front, and it's part of what makes, again, this moment so challenging. Flo asked me a question about the federal government and whether or not you can send them, she said National Guard, I think she means military, into Colorado, even if Colorado has not requested the troops. So I made a statement on this today. We researched it, and I am of the view that no, there are situations to defend the Constitution, or where you have a rebellion or a situation that a state can't handle, that the troops could be sent into a state. None of those circumstances are met here. Here you have an occasion for a state, Colorado, to use our police power with civilian police officers to manage peaceful protests. That is what is happening. It is not a situation that would justify military troops. And if that were to be attempted, we would be going to court to defend our police power, our 10th Amendment sovereignty. We've already had to do that once in a case involving the imposition of immigration restrictions on this law enforcement grant program called Burn Jag. And we said, you can't, after the fact, adopt these conditions. That's not how Congress authorized you to proceed. And we are going to protect our sovereign authority here in Colorado. And I went ahead and made that public statement. So I don't think they have that authority. And if they tried, we'd be in court on that issue.
Okay, next question, Phil, is from James Silvestro, and he asks, do you support legislation to reform qualified immunity?
Let me take James and Adrian's question together because they're sort of related. The Adrian question, I'll just read it, which is what's your message to law enforcement who want to do the right thing, and for officers who think there's nothing wrong with status quo? And these three questions are all related. The first thing I will say is about law enforcement officers wanting to do the right thing. I will say my commitment to police officer accountability, to the bad apples, if you will, is because I want to protect the good apples, and for the public to have trust in law enforcement of bad apples. And our office oversees the Peace Officers and Training Program, which has a two-function role, which is on the front end, we're involved in training, and on the back end, we're involved in certification. And the idea is we would decertify law enforcement officers who are engaging in activity that is unworthy of the profession. For example, those who might lie and violate the Brady requirement. And that is only a recent change that we got last year, and we're now in the process of implementing. If officers say there's nothing wrong with the status quo, I would ask them to listen, because what is evident to me, and it's not easy, when you're a white male, you don't have the experience of living in fear of an encounter with law enforcement, let alone jogging in a neighborhood in the light of day or bird watching in Central Park. And we've now had, in a very short time, repeated, clear, convincing, irrefutable examples. If you're a black man, the rules are different for you. And that's painful. And that comes in a history, a context of 400 years. It's not new. And a lot of people are like, well, why do I have to keep having this conversation? And I hear that frustration. And I believe police officers hear that frustration. And I believe we in Colorado are going to see legislation this session that will help us address these issues and will help us be in a position to lead on these issues. And I've not seen the specific qualified immunity one, but I've seen others. And I'll keep being open to good ideas here, because my general message is you need accountability and oversight and transparency so that we build trust. And that's true about law enforcement. That's true about business too. When I talk about consumer protection, part of what I say is we need to hold bad, irresponsible businesses accountable to build trust in responsible businesses. And so this is, for us, it's been a core priority and it will be a core priority. And if I can segue to the next question, Jennifer, is about the pretrial. Part of my commitment to reforming criminal justice is rooted in a related issue that is so painful for many people of color, which is when you look at who is incarcerated, it doesn't look like our population. When you look at who gets referred in high school to criminal complaints, it's different. So let me tell you a quick story about that. And I'll get back to pretrial, I promise. During the campaign, I was talking to people in Aurora, and they said, why are these school resource officers so quickly writing up complaints and criminal referrals for our high school students? And then when I was in the St. Vrain School District, the school superintendent said, we don't want our students getting escalated really quickly to criminal sanctions because that could affect the rest of their lives. And I thought, wait a minute, something is wrong with this picture. It was literally a tale of two school districts. And that's what we're up against. And people will give you different explanations. They'll call it systemic racism. They'll call it driven by implicit bias. It's wrong, and we have to address it. Now, the good news in Aurora is they've cut down by half the number of criminal referrals, citations in the schools. The bad news is we still have work to do on what is called the school-to-prison pipeline, and that's something our office is working on, and we're going to announce this summer some work that is going to be a part of this ongoing work. The other work that we are committed to is this pretrial work. Let me mention a little bit what that looks like. The short version is within a very quick period of time, call it 24 to 48 hours, we need a judgment made that is a risk-based judgment. Is someone a risk to hurt people? So for example, I heard about a story in Boulder where someone had done a series of domestic violence crimes. They were able to pay bail, got out, went to the home, got a gun. Thankfully, the police quickly were called. There was then a gunfight. No one got killed. But that was a foreseeable risk. And yet the person was able to pay a bail bond and get out. I can tell you other stories of people who are never been before charged with or convicted of a crime, have a job, have a family, they're in jail. They are no risk more than any other citizen. Let them out right away with no payment required. New Jersey's done that. Mesa County, Colorado's done that. It promotes public safety because when you keep people in jail for longer who otherwise could be out without being a risk, you actually make them more of a public safety risk because you've taken them from their job and their family. And so that's what pretrial reform looks like. And when you let them out, yes, you may have some monitoring of some kind, but the goal is get people out who don't have to be in jail. The challenge is it requires an investment to do that risk assessment, do that monitoring. Without money to do it, it's hard to make this reform. There are some local governments, I mentioned Mesa, Boulder's another, that are pushing this. It's so important. So is diversion programs, which is, hey, someone is, opioid dependent. Let's get them in a drug treatment program as opposed to keep them in jail. And the painful truth there is when someone goes to jail who's dependent on opioids, they start going through withdrawal. When they leave jail, they're 100 times more likely than another opioid dependent person to overdose. And so jail is not a humane strategy for someone who has a substance abuse disorder challenge. That's part of that agenda as well.
Thank you. So you can really feel a shared sense of frustration and pain in this next question. Mark Hansen asks, why does social change always seem to involve such painful and dramatic events? Shouldn't leadership involve proactive vision instead of reaction, always reaction?
Mark, I love your leadership and your proud buff. It is painful. Let me explain this issue and then I'll take Megan's question next too. So here's the thing. As a matter of public policy, we always are facing a question of what is urgent. And there's a lot of stuff that's really, really important that doesn't ever get urgency behind it. In my office, because of our leadership of the Peace Officer Standards and Training Program, we've been focused on this issue about trust in law enforcement, about police accountability, and we've been working on good public policy that we wanted to change. But without the moment we're now in, we didn't have a window of opportunity to push it. Now, that's frustrating to me. The pretrial reform is super frustrating to me because we don't have the money, but it should be urgent. And so all I can say is the role of leaders is to develop proactive, smart, humane policy, and then to look for the moment to catalyze change. And for those who want a really inspiring story, read the Lyndon Johnson biographies about the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Because what LBJ was able to do was, in the aftermath of the death of the president, JFK, in the aftermath of a march on Washington, he saw the vision, he knew the right thing to do, and was able to catalyze the moment. And so I would say, instead of shouldn't leadership involve proactive vision instead of reaction, leadership does involve proactive vision and the ability to seize a moment when it comes.
So Victoria Mandel asks, how can we help all of the people that were arrested in the protest in Denver?
So I believe there are different organizations who are working, and a challenge in a question like Victoria's is, and this is always a challenge, not to paint everything with a broad brush. There are some people arrested in Denver for bringing in dangerous weapons, and those people were not the peaceful protesters. But there are other protesters who somehow may have gotten cited, and really there's a good question that Victoria asked about those individuals, and I think there's some organizations out there, I don't know, who are working on this. So I'll leave to others to get back on that. That's a good question. Megan's question I didn't answer yet, so I want to answer, which is, how do we take this moment and how do we catalyze lasting change? And I do think it's through a variety of efforts. One is we work to strengthen and use our tools to help us be a leading state in how do we both train and manage accountability of our law enforcement. The training front, and this is a natural for me as someone who spent this career in teaching, we have the opportunity to reimagine training. And one of the things we're working with the legislature, and we had gotten this done before this time, is how we can reconceive of the core competencies that law enforcement professionals need to have. And this is something that we did at the law school, thinking about what core competency lawyers need to have. We're doing this now for law enforcement professionals. And to give you one important example, we need to be better developing emotional intelligence among law enforcement. And when I toured a prison, I had this great exchange with a correctional officer who said to me, I was a nurse before I was a corrections officer. I've got a taser, but I've got my voice. And I know to use my voice before my taser. That's emotional intelligence. I believe it can be developed, and we're going to work on both identifying and developing the best law enforcement we can, which can make a real difference in the environment. And then also what we can do in our Department of Law, in our law schools, and I know Jim's leadership on this has been extraordinary, a real commitment to diversity and inclusion. We have to recognize that we have a special stewardship role around what it means to provide equal justice, and that only comes when we have people in law enforcement, in prosecution, in AG's office, in law schools, who look like our states, and that's on us.
Thank you. Switching topics back to voting and representation, your former colleague, Professor Ming Chen, asks, you've talked about Colorado's leadership role in providing nearly universal mail-in ballots. What effect, if any, does this have on electoral outcomes specifically? How will extending access to mail-in or absentee ballots in other states affect the 2020 election, especially in light of COVID-19 public health threats to in-person voting?
Thanks, Ming. Let me start with the fact that the Wisconsin experience is a negative role model. We should never again put people in the position of having to risk their public health or their personal health or the right to vote. I believe, and I just did a webinar on this it was a great webinar. I don't know if it's still on the web. It was with the Aging Alliance. I'd recommend it. I believe 46 states have some form of absentee mail-in balloting. The majority of those states have it where you've got to ask for it, unlike in Colorado where you get it automatically. In Idaho, they're doing a primary right now. They've had more people ask for absentee ballots than who voted in the last primary. And so the first answer to Ming's question is we need an all-out push to get absentee ballots to every single person who can in all 46 states. And we've got to make sure that that's done in a way that is scaled up. Now, in the normal world, Congress would be all in to enable and support this capacity building. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if we're going to get that support from Congress or not. One thing we've done in Colorado, and Ming's question teed this up beautifully, is we've shown how this can be done. And we've told other states we're happy to help provide you lessons learned and how you build this capacity. Because we've done it very well in Colorado. We've shown extremely little fraud. There are ways to make sure that people who get the ballots mailed to them in advance are the right people, check the signatures. And I do hope that for those 46 states, we see it done the best it can be. For the 4 states, I hope they can change their laws to at least allow this possibility. And we should be at a place where participation in our elections is not a partisan issue. It is an American constitutional issue. And that came across well in the webinar we did.
Well, Phil, as I said, we have a lot of questions, so we're going to get as many as we can. One coming in from YouTube from Isabel Brower, going back to the topic of the day. In addition to some of the criminal justice and policing issues you addressed in your presentation, what state-level policy changes are most essential to deconstructing structural racism?
Part of what we need, Isabel, and we're so thrilled to have you as part of our team, is we need honest reconciliation with facts and an ability to deal with structural racism and the legacy of systemic racism that is, as you know, it's not, for those who say this is only a criminal justice and policing issue, I don't know many people would say that, but as Isabel says, that's not the whole story. African-American women, I don't know the number, but it's markedly higher, likely to die in childbirth than white women. African-Americans and people of color have been more likely to die of COVID than white people. That demands our attention. It demands our response. Education. Many people of color can recount stories where they were said, Michelle Obama had this in her famous autobiography now, oh, you're not Princeton material. The word that sometimes people use for this is microaggressions in healthcare, in education, in criminal justice. People continue to face indignities, and they know that they're getting that treatment different because of their skin color. And what we can ask of this moment is that acknowledgement, and then area by area, we've got to work towards equal justice. Ours was a nation with a founding aspiration of all men are created equal. Ours is also a nation that at its founding accepted slavery. That is a contradiction that we've continued to have to work through. And I do often quote, and for those who haven't seen John Lewis quote it, it's beautiful, his statement about the protests and the opportunity this moment. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And it's got to continue. And part of what many people say is, I'm just exhausted. And my answer is, we can't afford to be exhausted. We've got work to do.
So I would like to get to Josh's question, but I wanted to also make sure we get a question from at least one student, or the first identifiable student anyway that we've seen here. So Matthew Dillon asks, I was fortunate enough to be able to listen to your appearance before the Supreme Court. Today you've discussed how to lead institutionally. Does leadership as an advocate in court look the same, or is it different?
So Matthew, let me start on this a little tangentially, and I'll try to get to your really good question. part of what I hadn't fully appreciated by doing the Supreme Court argument, it was something I wanted to do because I had the chance to clerk at the Supreme Court. I had done arguments in the 10th Circuit, but getting to argue Supreme Court case, if you're not like in this elite group of Washington lawyers, is really hard. One of the paths is either being a Solicitor General or being Attorney General. No one appointed me Solicitor General. I was going to get elected Attorney General, so I was willing to take this on. I would say that one of the benefits of doing that was I do think I could be a leader by being an advocate, which is to say a leader who shows team members, I'm one of you, I will put in the same work you will do. It's powerful. You hear this a lot in athletics, which is a coach says, I'm not asking you to do anything I wouldn't do, or the team captain saying, I'm not asking you to do. And I did this as the dean, but I didn't even think about it because I just love teaching so much. I kept teaching as a dean. But I would say if you're a dean and you've never taught, it's hard to be a leader. If you're the Attorney General and you're not willing to roll up your sleeves and take on a case, your team might not look at you the same way. And I did it because it had been something that I had long wanted to do, and I really do love the art of appellate advocacy. And I think it was actually enabling of my leadership. But to your point, there are different skills. The skills of being an appellate advocate is different as being a leader. Being a leader is much more about building a team and leading indirectly. And I do think, as the coaching metaphor suggests, there's some fabulous coaches who are not really great players, but are great coaches. And so there are different skills. I do think the willingness to do it did actually enable me as a leader and as a part of the team. And that was a benefit of doing it.
Okay, we're running short on time. Josh Pence has been waited patiently with this question, and it's a nice big picture question. Josh Pence asks, Phil, I'd like to hear a little more about ingenuity in a time of lean resources. I often find that there is not a lack of great ideas, but there are a lack of resources to implement them. How is your team prioritizing great ideas that bring with them a new resource demand?
Josh, this is a really, really good note to end on. And so let me take this and give sort of closing reflection, because I do think there's a real opportunity for all of us as we reflect on this. And so part of the challenge, as Josh puts it well, is this is something that's a systemic challenge. And it gets back to the really good question asked earlier by Mark Hansen, is the urgent can crowd out the important. Or to put it one way, people in government can put out fires all day, but they're never actually thinking about what the overarching opportunities and goals are. And the challenge for leadership is both coaching and developing the institutional muscle, but it's also having, to Mark Hansen's point, the proactive vision to say, I know where we're trying to go, and I'm going to look for opportunities to get there. Let me give you a few examples on that. So Rahm Emanuel has this famous saying, which gets, again, to Mark Hansen's point, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. What that means is when you have a crisis, whether it's a public health crisis, an economic crisis, or a justice crisis, that's calling for solutions. And leaders need to have taken the time to develop solutions, to have ideas, and not be afraid to implement them. Because if you never think ahead about what you're trying to do, you'll never see the moments, you'll never be ready for the moments. So when this justice crisis hits us, and the legislature is saying, what do we do to build trust in law enforcement, police accountability, we're ready to engage and to advance what had already been a goal of ours. When we're talking about consumers who are worried about debt collectors, we have ideas, we have institutional muscle, we're willing and able to develop solutions to provide protections for people with student loans. And so, Josh, part of what leadership has to do is create space to not merely be subject to the urgent, but to know what's important. And I had this experience when I went to Washington, because I took a leave of absence and moved my family to Washington. And I said, shame on me if I just go sit there in a bunch of meetings and feel like I was at the table, but didn't actually develop strategic initiatives that I was committed to helping to push and could look back and say, hey, I helped drive progress here. So at the Justice Department, we reformed how we looked at mergers, doing a set of merger guidelines that's helped the Justice Department crack down on mergers and address concentration. At the White House, I worked on addressing wireless spectrum to get all this spectrum out there to support broadband and to support interoperable broadband network for public safety. Those were strategic initiatives that were important, and I didn't get crowded out by the issue of the day. And so this is not an easy thing to do, Josh. I think the fact that you're thinking about it, that you worry about it, is a good sign. If every leader in government, public servant like yourself, says, what are my strategic goals? You can look for those opportunities. You can make sure they're on your agenda. And that's your job as a leader. I've given you a sense of what my goals are. And just to sum up, because I think it's important, with respect to the organization itself, I want our organization to operate with a deep commitment to principle, to build trust that what we do is in service of the people of Colorado. I want us to be collaborative, and as Matt Willis said, building and working with stakeholders across the public and private sectors. And I want us to be innovative, not asking how have we always done something, but what's the best way to do it. And I also want us to be thinking about these issues. I've mentioned the rule of law a bit and how we defend our institutions. That obviously includes this justice crisis where we need to build confidence in law enforcement and have the right oversight and accountability. I've mentioned how do we address the opioid epidemic at a time when, for many of our communities, it's having an extraordinarily painful impact, and we have some tools to do something about it. I've talked about how we reform criminal justice to protect people and to address, among other things, the racial disparities we have in the criminal justice system. I've also talked about how we manage our water so that we're not taking water at the expense of rural communities who depend on water as a lifeblood, and that we do it in a way that serves all of Colorado. I've also not talked as much, and this is shame on me for not doing this at CU Law, but we've got a whole agenda protecting our land, air, and water. And that includes things like water quality and includes the clean car standards. And this is something we'll keep on top of. And protecting consumers in a range of ways where there are those who take advantage of them. And also finally, the public health crisis and how we adapt to it. So we have a robust agenda about how we view the department as an engine for innovation and progress, and how do we address a series of issues that are at the fore of what our state needs and how we can be at the leading edge for what our country needs.
Thank you so much, Phil. I know that I'm not the only person who stands in awe and appreciation at your ability to move from important topic to important topic with such wisdom and knowledge and optimism. So thank you for that. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to Dean Anaya for closing remarks.
Thanks, Jen, and thank you, Phil, for a terrific, thought-provoking talk and leading us in a great discussion. And thanks to Jen Sullivan for moderating. Phil, you've certainly given us a lot to think about, including your call to all of us as citizens to do our part to resolve the difficult issues we face. And thank you all for joining us and for engaging in an important conversation. By the end of the week, you'll receive a link to a recording of the presentation and a survey to share your thoughts with us. And Colorado attorneys will receive a link for the CLE affidavit. I want to add a word of thanks to our terrific staff for making this presentation possible. Thanks to Yesenia Delgado, John Sabre, Tara Teslo, and Georgette Vigil. The next program offering is the Supreme Court review on July 16 at noon, moderated by Colorado Supreme Court Justice Melissa Hart. Details for that will be emailed to you. Again, thank you all for joining, and thank you, Phil, for a great presentation, great discussion. I wish you all the best. Good evening.
Thanks, everybody.